The tens of thousands of Israeli citizens and hundreds of thousands of Lebanese civilians will be able to return to their home, and it's designed to be a permanent end to this war.
The FBI is investigating a series of threats to several of President-elect Donald Trump's cabinet picks.
Now, Tater is here in a backup role just in case Tot can't fulfill his duties. So he's sort of like the vice turkey.
Hi, I'm Scott McFarland, CBS News in Washington, and welcome to America Decides, and happy almost Thanksgiving. Several of President-elect Trump's picks were the targets of swatting and bomb threats this morning and last night. In a statement, his transition team said, quote, "With President Trump as our example, dangerous acts of intimidation and violence will not deter us." CBS News has learned these threats did not impact anyone with Secret Service protection, including the president-elect. Meantime, Trump has announced a flurry of new picks. Retired General Keith Kellogg was tapped to serve as the special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, and a doctor who opposed COVID lockdowns was selected to lead the National Institutes of Health. And after a long delay, Trump's team has signed some, but not all, of the critical transition documents with the Biden administration. My colleagues Nicole Skanga, Weijia Jiang, and Torian Small are tracking the latest on all of this. We have a dream team here. We begin with Nicole here at the desk. All right, so Nicole, we've heard some of the names associated with these possible swattings and bomb threats. What's law enforcement saying?
Yeah, Scott, good to be with you, and let's break it down. So police are investigating this slew of overnight attacks targeting Trump cabinet picks and some senior to-be administration officials. The attacks range from swatting incidents to bomb threats. And just to remind our viewers, swatting, it's a dangerous, illegal tactic. Someone makes a false emergency call in order to prompt a dramatic police response. In some cases, SWAT teams dispatched to the homes of public figures, celebrities, enemies. In this case, there were police that showed up on some of the doorsteps of these officials. In addition, certain individuals, Representative Lee Zeldin, saying that he received a threat of a pipe bomb at his home. So we're seeing a bit of variety here. In New York, the officials targeted Representative Elise Stefanik, Trump's pick to be UN ambassador.
And these are dangerous, potentially, for the recipient of a swatting attack if they don't know it's
Absolutely.
coming.
You have SWAT teams arriving on your doorstep. It is designed to intimidate. It is designed to harass. And it is illegal. And under federal law, if charged, it is punishable for several decades behind bars and in some cases life in prison. And just to circle back to some of the other officials that were also targeted, we know of some in Florida, including Pam Bondi, the pick to lead the Department of Justice, Susie Wiles, White House Chief of Staff, and in Texas, Brooke Rollins, Agriculture Secretary pick.
All right, Nicole, I'm going to bring in Weijia in a moment to get some reaction. But first, Weijia, let's listen to Tom Homan, Trump's choice to be border czar, and he was asked about this today. Take a listen.
I haven't received this level of threats in the last few days myself. So I'm shocked at what happened in the last 24 hours. Again, I haven't received that level of threat, but I think the government, if they find out it's coming from a foreign nation, of course we got to respond to them. This isn't acceptable for Republican or Democrat. I mean, no one that serves their country should be under threat.
Weijia, more broadly, how is the Trump transition reacting to this?
Well, they are making clear that they are not going to be intimidated or deterred. At least that is what the spokesperson said in a statement about these threats. And they said that they are using President Trump himself as an example of how they will continue to forge forward and do the work that is required to be doing. Of course, this was not spelled out in the statement, but you're probably the last person I have to tell, Scott, about what the president-elect faced himself, an assassination attempt. And so these threats of political violence are not new to this administration. We also know that President Biden has been briefed, and the White House says they continue to work with law enforcement and Trump's team to monitor this closely. And Biden also condemned political violence, Scott.
And there was a series of swatting incidents a year ago, Christmas week in 2023, where public officials of both parties were getting targeted. So, Nicole, that underscores the reality here. These are difficult to solve.
Absolutely. And swatters often use technology like caller ID spoofing. They'll use TTY or teletypewriting technology in order to try to conceal where that number is coming from and to pretend that it's coming from a victim's phone line. And so the FBI, along with local law enforcement, will now work together to identify patterns within these digital messages. These threats, we're told, were relayed over email, over social media platforms, try to chase those email domains, see if there's a foreign nexus here. But this is a long process. Oftentimes it takes months or years for attribution in this case. And, you know, just every law enforcement official I have spoken to today is reluctant to talk in more detail about this, Scott, in part because it is so dangerous and because they don't want to inspire copycat attacks.
Copycats are a grave risk in this area. Weijia, let's talk about the business of the day. Over the past 24 hours, pretty busy for the Trump transition, announcing would-be designees for administration posts. What's the latest in the names you're hearing, and what do you make of them?
Well, Scott, there are a couple names that really stick out to me because they sort of symbolize what we know to be true of what President-elect Trump is looking for. Disruptors, number one. And we see that from who he has chosen to lead the National Institute of Health, and that is Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. And we know that during the pandemic, he was extremely critical of the doctors who were leading the U.S. response to COVID-19, including Dr. Anthony Fauci. And he blasted the use of masks, lockdowns, and called vaccines propaganda. And we just interviewed a CBS News medical contributor, Dr. Celine Grounder, who said this, paired with the pick of RFK Jr. for Secretary of Health and Human Services, says to her that Trump is moving from science to politics. And she is really concerned and says many of her colleagues in the medical community are as well, because the two just do not belong anywhere near each other. So she is closely watching how this could reshape the agencies. And the second point that I want to make about Trump and who he's looking for is loyalty, which is something we've talked about from the beginning. And he appointed a Secretary of the Navy, and that is going to be John Fallon, who has no military experience. He has never served in the military, but he is a Trump mega donor and a businessman who leads a private investment firm, Scott. And Trump says that, you know, above all else, he is going to focus on the business of the U.S. Navy and carry out the America First agenda. So those two names certainly stuck out.
Weijia Jiang in West Palm Beach. Nicole Skanga, the west side of the desk. Happy Thanksgiving.
Good to hear.
Thank you very much. Let's bring in Torian Small, who's in Nantucket, Massachusetts this Thanksgiving. All right, Torian, so what is the White House saying about Trump refusing to sign those transition documents that took so long for the transition team to sign?
Well, the White House is certainly signaling that it's going to continue with its plan to ensure a peaceful transfer of power. A Biden official confirming that while the Trump team has signed one memorandum of understanding for the White House, others have not been signed yet. That includes the Department of Justice. DOJ Spock's telling CBS News as of 3 p.m. this afternoon, the Trump team has not agreed to the terms of its transition documents. That is pretty important because that would ensure security clearances, access to national security information, really important stuff there. But that same Spock is saying that the department is pretty confident that they will find progress toward an agreement sometime soon. Trump's pick for Chief of Staff Susie Wiles put out a statement saying that concerns about why this administration, this incoming administration, is rejecting these agreements is a bit overblown. She believes that she wants to cut costs for taxpayers by not agreeing to go through the traditional routes of this transition process, usually through the General Services Administration that usually funds the transition process. They're saying the Trump-Vance campaign can foot the bill in this time.
Second day in a row, Tori, and pretty big foreign policy victory for the Biden administration. Ceasefire in Lebanon yesterday, and today securing the release of 3 longtime detained Americans in China. What is the Biden administration saying about this, or what can you tell us about the developments?
Yeah, well, we know that this is happening in exchange for an identified Chinese national. These three Americans have been held in China for quite some time, the longest for over a decade, since 2012. According to the National Security Council, the president has been a part of these talks for some time now with China, including with Chinese President Xi Jinping, as recent as earlier this month during an economic forum in Peru. They've been having conversations about the release of these Americans. And as we saw, like you just mentioned there, Scott, this did in fact happen.
Yeah, 12 years for the longest of those three detainees, headed home to family finally. Torian Small in Massachusetts, thank you. The first Trump administration was met by resistance from Democratic activists, lawmakers, and grassroots groups. Up next, we're joined by the CEO of an organization that took the Trump administration to court more than 100 times. You're watching America Decides.
Don't you ever let anybody take your power from you. You have the same power that you did before November 5th.
That was Vice President Harris's most recent message to supporters after the Democrats' second loss to Donald Trump. 8 years ago, when Trump took office for the first time, we saw an immediate response and 4 years of proactive resistance. So how fierce will the pushback be this time? Skye Perriman joins us now. Skye is president and CEO of Democracy Forward, which is a nonprofit, progressive-leaning legal organization. Skye, thanks for making time on a holiday week. What may be different this time? How might your challenges be different than they were in 2017?
You know, I think this is a challenging time. We have a president-elect that on the campaign trail distanced himself from Project 2025, disavowed it, and we're already seeing him appoint a number of people, or at least announce the intention to appoint a number of people that really want to accelerate an extreme agenda. And so it is going to be important that people in communities have representation in court this time, because a lot of what the president-elect and his associates are planning to do is not only harmful, but it is unlawful. So I think you'll see a lot of litigation. That is certainly what we are planning, and at Democracy Forward, should the administration break the law. And I also think that you'll see a lot of people in community really seeking to build their own collective power, institutions standing up for science, for evidence, standing against extremism is going to be really important this time.
You mentioned Project 2025 as a possible source of pushback, maybe as a source of litigation. That thing touches on everything from veterans issues, Social Security, nuclear policy, communications. How do you triage or pick what might be first?
Well, I think that the president-elect has made clear now in these days after the election a range of things that they're going to seek to accelerate, including undermining the ability of our government to work for all people through our independent civil service, undermining healthcare access, and a range of things that people and communities rely on. And so, you know, it will be important that all people use their voice in this time, and triaging it, I think, is really some of the most extreme proposals seeking to weaponize the government against the American people. Those are the ones that you're going to see immediate and forceful responses to.
You're not a political organization, you're a nonprofit, but perhaps it's worth noting that some progressive media audiences have declined since the election. Those who cater to the progressive audience may be having a more difficult time mobilizing the troops, galvanizing the troops. Have you noticed that? Has your organization seen maybe a lack of enthusiasm or fervor that you may have enjoyed in 2016 and 2017?
No, what we've actually seen is that institutions are much more organized than they were last time. I think it was hard for the American people and hard for many organizations to really envision the level of extremism that we saw in the last administration. This time, the legal community is more prepared. We have launched an effort called Democracy 2025, which you can go to the website, democracy2025.org, to see hundreds of organizations that have coalesced around, of course, a hope that this is an administration that will govern and will serve all of the American people, but a real resolve that if they don't, and if they break the law and engage in policies and activities to the detriment of people and communities, that there will be representation in court and in other spaces for those communities to push back.
Don't you see Republicans also being more unified and more organized to champion Trump's policies? Famously, John McCain stood up to then President Trump and stopped the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. Is it a bigger hurdle for you that Republicans seem to be more speaking with one voice this time?
It's interesting. I don't think we've seen that, at least in the last few weeks. We've already seen the president-elect have to walk away from one of his nominees to lead the Department of Justice because there was not unity on that. But we do know that there is an organized, very far-right effort in this country. That is an effort that does not represent the majority of people. We saw the majority of people have rejected Project 2025. It's why the president-elect had to distance himself from it. In deep red states, we saw ballot initiatives on abortion access and public education and climate win this last time. So we know where the American people are, and I do think but we also know that there is an organized opposition.
Who do you see as being the face of the initial resistance in the coming years? There were some Democrats who overachieved down ballot. There are some aspiring, likely future candidates, but who would you recommend or see as the face of the resistance?
What I hope is that you'll see the faces of people and communities across this nation, those that may not agree on everything or every policy matter, but that all agree on the importance of democracy and the importance of a government for all people. I hope that what we see is those diverse communities, everyone's from veterans to healthcare to frontline workers to voters to students to parents, really unified in this moment to say that there is no mandate for extremism. There is a candidate and now a president-elect who won electorally, but he only did so by distancing himself from these extreme policies that he's now seeking to accelerate. And so what I hope we see and what we will work to see is that it will really be we the people that will need to be the face of this next chapter of American life.
Sky Perriman, we'll monitor your work moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
President Biden has announced a new push to end the conflict in Gaza after the U.S. helped secure a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah. Ahead, we'll look at the impact. You're watching America Decides. President Biden says his administration is making, quote, another push to end the war in Gaza after the U.S. helped broker a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, a ceasefire that took effect today. CBS News foreign correspondent Deborah Patta has more from Jerusalem.
Israel and Hezbollah exchanged heavy fire until the very last moment before the ceasefire began. But from early this morning, the skies were quiet for the first time in more than a year. Under the agreement, Israel must withdraw from Lebanon and Hezbollah retreat north of the Litani River, while Lebanese troops and UN forces keep the peace. Despite official warnings that it's still too dangerous to go home, thousands of displaced Lebanese strapped their belongings onto their cars and headed south, almost as quickly as they'd fled the violence before. Here, so many found that they had lost everything. Across the border, Israelis evacuated from the northern Kiryat Shmona were also reeling from the losses of war, and people are worried there that the truce will be breached. There is distrust on both sides. It's going to be a tense 60 days waiting to see if this ceasefire holds. And this deal has also revived hope for a Gaza ceasefire, but a former Israeli military intelligence officer told us he's convinced Israel will not be leaving the Palestinian territory for a very long time. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah Patta. CBS News contributor Robert Berger joins us now from Jerusalem. Robert, thank you very much. What does this Hezbollah peace deal for Lebanon mean for Gaza? Any impact?
Definitely. I think, Hamas has been isolated now because Hezbollah is no longer part of the fight. Hamas's strategy all along, according to U.S. and Israeli officials, was to try and turn this into a regional war, and they really succeeded for a while. Israel and Iran have traded direct blows for the first time in history this year, a couple of times with ballistic missiles and airstrikes. And now Iran, who is the sponsor of Hezbollah, is basically out because Hezbollah is out. So that leaves Hamas on its own now to deal with the war with Israel that's been going on for more than a year. perhaps they'll be more likely to move toward a deal. That's the hope anyway.
So what are the obstacles, or at least what are the greatest obstacles between Israel and Hamas getting to this agreement?
The obstacles are the same as they have been all year. Hamas is demanding a complete end to the war, not a ceasefire, which has been basically what U.S. and other mediators like Qatar and Egypt were trying to get, was a phased deal with starting with a 6-week ceasefire. Hamas wants a complete end to the war, permanent end to the war, and an Israeli pullout from Gaza to win the release of those about 101 hostages still left in Gaza. Israel refuses to agree to that because the stated aim of the war is to destroy Hamas, and that hasn't happened yet.
Does President Biden leaving office change the calculus here at all, or the recipe towards success?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of it could go either way because President-elect Trump has urged Israel to end this war quickly. So on the one hand, Israel could say, well, let's try to end this and get a ceasefire with Gaza before Mr. Trump comes in order that he doesn't have to deal with that as soon as he takes office. On the other hand, maybe Israel would wait and hold that ceasefire deal for when Mr. Trump does take office, as to give him the diplomatic victory instead of the Biden administration. Remember, we've seen quite a bit of tension between the U.S. and Israel over Israel's handling of the war.
The 60 days that's been built into this ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hezbollah seems to be a lot of runway, a lot of green in front of the combatants. Is there any concern it won't hold for 2 months?
Of course, there's certainly that concern. Let's just say that today we got off to a good start. The ceasefire has now held for 1 day. It's supposed to go for 60 days, what they call the temporary ceasefire, with a gradual Israeli pullout from Lebanon. And Hezbollah is supposed to move 18 miles north of the Israeli border to the north of the Litani River. Let me just say that seems to be in the interest of both Israel and Hezbollah to make this work. Israeli forces are exhausted after 14 months of war, including both fighting in both Gaza and Lebanon. They're running short of munitions, while Hezbollah has suffered severe blows from Israel, including the assassination of its top leaders. So it seems to be in the interest of both sides right now to make this work.
Domestically here in the U.S., it's hard to escape this bottom line question. What are the prospects for there being real progress overall in the Middle East before January 20th, before the next president takes over?
Well, you know, it's kind of dangerous. We've learned over the past year or so that timetables for a deal or for a ceasefire, it's kind of dangerous to make a prediction. Remember back in March, President Biden said that he expected that there was going to be a deal in a week. That was 8 months ago. So, and then Antony Blinken, the Secretary of State, maybe 2-3 months ago said, well, we're at the 10-yard line. Only 10 yards to go, and we still don't have a deal. So I think we're going to try and see some creative diplomacy by the U.S. and mediators like Qatar and Egypt to try and get things moving again, but it's hard to predict how long this will take.
We were grateful for your service and your reporting and for staying up so very late for us tonight. Robert Berger from Jerusalem, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Coming up, as we've reported, President-elect Trump is finalizing his cabinet. Our reporter panel joins us to discuss what his most recent picks say about how he'll govern. You're watching America Decides.
And I will end the war in Ukraine. Should have never started. If I were president, would have never started.
Donald Trump has long promised he could end the war in Ukraine on day one. Now he's tapped retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg to help him try to get that job done. Kellogg served as Chief of Staff on the National Security Council during the first Trump administration and was also Vice President Mike Pence's National Security Advisor. Let's bring in our reporter panel tonight, Tom Lobianco and Mia McCarthy. Tom is co-founder, national political reporter for 24/7 News, and Mia is politics reporter for Politico. Thank you both. Tom, let's start off with Trump's promise to end the wars abroad. What do you make of the pick of Keith Kellogg as special envoy for Ukraine and Russia as part of getting that job done?
Yeah, Kellogg's a very interesting selection coming out of the America First Policy Institute. Certainly, the first Trump administration. We all know him as Vice President Mike Pence's national security advisor. But folks inside Trump world will tell you that he was an early supporter of Trump, and even during the Republican primary, he actually backed Trump over Pence. Now, he's a little bit more of a traditional, conservative war hawk, so to say. He does not seem to come out of that fold of Tucker Carlson, Tulsi Gabbard, Russia adjacent style. And it's certainly interesting seeing him picked over Rick Grenell, who had been floated as that possibly for that envoy to Russia and Ukraine.
Did that selection surprise you at all?
Late in the game here, in these, as things have sort of normalized, so to say, and I use that term loosely, referring to all Trump administrations. But certainly after the Matt Gaetz kerfuffle, things have kind of settled a little bit. And the America First Policy Institute has kind of been the shadow White House, the White House in waiting. And he's been very close with that wing of Trump world. So this seems to signal more of a normalizing and a stabilizing of these elections.
Mia, I want to pivot to you. Your new reporting on Trump's incoming National Security Advisor designee working well with the current one, Jake Sullivan. It was a striking headline we saw from your reporting. Tell us more about it.
Sure. So Mike Waltz, he's a Florida congressman who's been tapped as Trump's national security advisor. He said in an interview over the weekend on Fox that he was working with current national security advisor Jake Sullivan. It was definitely, a little bit different than some of the headlines we've been seeing recently. But I think the message that Waltz was really trying to portray, especially to foreign adversaries, was that this is not a time for foreign adversaries to have any funny business going on. I think they were trying to portray the message that, they are working together. This is not a transitionary period of chaos, especially in regards to national security issues and especially in regards to our foreign adversaries.
It's been a real intense few weeks. You've been covering the Trump transition, and it's coming at us like a fire hose. We noted the recent estimated total of popular vote is that Donald Trump won by about 1.6% overall nationwide. And the Trump team argues that that's a mandate. Mia, what did the recent picks in this transition indicate to you about how he's going to govern with that mandate moving forward?
Yeah, I think these picks so far, especially, first with the Matt Gaetz kerfuffle, that was almost in some ways a way of testing that mandate. There were plenty of lawmakers that I had talked to who said that they were planning on supporting any, cabinet picks that Trump put forward because he had this mandate. Now, as you mentioned, that percentage of the quote unquote mandate has decreased slightly. And, there is questions over whether, it is truly a mandate. But I think regardless, Trump, for a lot of these Republicans who now have control of the House and the Senate, they still see that as a mandate. And it's going to be interesting in the next few weeks to see if these cabinet picks, especially other ones who are facing some other controversies like Pete Hegseth, RFK Jr., if they are, going to apply to this said mandate.
Tom, let me bounce that same question off of you. Are you detecting any roadmap Trump's laying out for how he's actually going to govern?
Roadmaps and Trump are not necessarily two things we consider together very often. But it has been very fascinating to me in terms of these nominations and the types of people who are being floated now, as Mia noted here, that a lot of it seems to be reflective of the Senate's response. I saw Jim Risch, who is, he's not a hardcore Trump loyalist, but certainly no softy when it, comes to the Senate Republicans, mentioning to a reporter recently, I think it was in regard to the Tulsi Gabbard nomination, saying, well, let's just see what happens after the hearings. And that goes to, just a few weeks ago, and this goes to the overall question of the mandate. Just a few weeks ago, you had a lot of the Trump folks saying, we're going to shove these nominations down the Senate's throat, and we will use recess appointments to do that. Now you don't hear that talk as much. So I think, again, reflective of the actual results themselves and the way that everybody is reacting to these things, you're starting to see a settling around Washington.
Well, things have settled sufficiently, Tom. The Democrats and members of the Harris campaign are finally speaking out with their diagnoses of what happened and what went wrong. I want to take a listen to some of what they said over the past 72 hours.
Republicans don't make Trump apologize. As Stephanie said, we don't have to mimic it. But I think that there are a lot of times where if you're in the Democratic Party and you step out of line, you get punished for it.
All right, Tom, what do you make of that?
Oh, that was very fascinating. I saw that podcast, and one of the things that was really interesting coming out of that, they talked at length further in the podcast about the trouble that they had on the campaign getting on some of these popular podcasts like Hot Ones. And a lot of podcasters were saying that they just didn't want to get involved in politics. And I think that this gets to, it's two different cultures. When you look at Democrats and Republicans, it gets to a lot of the problems that Democrats and the center left are dealing with right now is how do you get through to culture, particularly in a time when Joe Rogan and Dana White and Theo Von are very much ensconced on the right and very happy to be a part of that, but not so much kind of your center-left podcasters. So they have some big problems to deal with.
Not to mention any number of progressives and Democrats tuning out politics right now because of the results of the election. I mean, let me ask you this. We've heard so much about Pete Hegseth and Tulsi Gabbard to a degree. You're watching the transition and the choices from Donald Trump. Any other names that are on your radar as potential friction points when the new Congress takes over January 3rd?
Yeah, for sure. I think the main spotlight is definitely on the two of them. There have been, plenty of discourse about both of those picks from Democrats and even Republicans not necessarily fully supporting. So I think that's definitely where the main focus is going to be. But there are still going to be some other picks that, have some friction as they face Senate confirmation. I think one of those examples, Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, I think Durbin, he had said he had some issues with her, and he does just need a full. She does just need a Republican majority to get through. So, assuming that Murkowski and Collins are behind her, I think with Gates, it does make it a little bit easier. But she is a Trump loyalist. She is someone who, has defended a lot of what Trump has said in the past. So I wouldn't be surprised if that caused some friction. And even RFK Jr., he has had some issues. He has had some friction within both parties as well.
And the senators know Pam Bondi. She was the defense attorney for Trump at that first impeachment trial before the Senate. Tom, I have just a moment left, so sorry to do this to you, but I'm going to do this to you. What Democratic lawmakers are you watching with aspirations over the next few months?
Yeah, absolutely. Hakeem Jeffries, very tight as minority leader, very tight margin, could become speaker depending upon the next election. But I'm watching a lot of the Gen Z folks, Maxwell Frost, Jasmine Crockett. There's been a big turning to the new generation after the election results. So those are two big names I'm keeping an eye on.
Two very effective messengers for the Democratic caucus so far in their careers. Tom LoBianco, Mia McCarthy, thank you both.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Former New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez is asking for a new trial and for a judge to toss his corruption and bribery convictions. In a 38-page filing, his lawyers allege improper evidence that should have been redacted was shown to jurors. In July, Menendez was found guilty on all 16 charges he faced and is currently scheduled to be sentenced in federal court in Manhattan January 29th. Linda McMahon has been tapped to lead the U.S. Department of Education. But how exactly does she factor into Trump's promise to eliminate the U.S. Department of Education? That's coming up next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. While on the campaign trail, President-elect Donald Trump vowed to shutter the U.S. Department of Education, and an effort to do so is already in the works before his second term begins. Last week, South Dakota Republican Senator Mike Rounds introduced this legislation that would abolish the department 180 days after the bill becomes law. But if the Education Department is actually eliminated, how exactly would that affect school systems across the country? Erica Meltzer may have the answer. She's national editor at Chalkbeat, a nonprofit news organization that covers education in the U.S. Erica, let's start right there. Try to draw a line, if you can, between eliminating the Department of Education and K-12 schools or higher ed in America.
I think it's really important for people to understand that most school funding comes from the state and local level, and that we will still have public education if the Department of Education goes away. The department only goes back about 40 years. At the same time, the U.S. Department of Education provides a lot of important functions. They provide billions of dollars in funding to high poverty schools. They provide guidance around civil rights enforcement and how to best serve children with disabilities. And they provide a lot of higher ed functions as well, for example, running the financial aid system. And so I do think people would notice if the department went away.
We know the Department of Education tried to navigate that crisis this year with the free application for student aid, the FAFSA program. Does this embolden the proposals to get rid of the department, or is that a firewall against proposals to get rid of the department because you see the impact they can have on student loan applicants?
I think a lot of the proposals to get rid of the department, sort of what would the impact be? It depends on sort of, like, for example, that's a function. Some people think it should go away entirely. Some people would say that could be handled elsewhere within the government. I do think the problems with the FAFSA, which were real, did give more energy to this idea that it's an overloaded bureaucracy that's not really serving students. But at the same time, there have been conservative calls to abolish the Department of Education going back to Reagan. This is not a new idea. It did not emerge, fully formed from the FAFSA debacle.
What's another part of the portfolio of this department folks might be familiar with? I always associate it with Title IX, but what are the things this department does in a more granular way that does impact citizens and folks' lives?
Well, Title IX is a great example. Title IX protects against sex discrimination, and in more recent years has been interpreted to also protect students on the basis of gender identity, and that's been a real point of contention between conservatives and progressives in American schools, something that we could absolutely see change under the Trump administration. And in general, civil rights enforcement is a function of the Department of Education that typically looks very different under Republican and Democratic administrations. And so, for example, you could see civil rights enforcement. There are ways that could be used to go after DEI initiatives or what the Republicans have deemed sort of woke ideologies in education. They also do kind of boring things like highlight research into educational practices and help schools understand, if you're working with English learners or if you're trying to improve math instruction, here are the things that are evidence-based that could actually help students. And so some of those functions are potentially in danger.
Erica, Politico is reporting today on how Republicans across the U.S. are pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into private education in spite of voter and strong union resistance. Do those initiatives have enough political support to make an impact, a lasting impact on U.S. education?
This is something that's really developing at the state level. We have, I believe, a dozen states now that have universal school vouchers. There's a bunch of other states that could be passing legislation in 2025. And this is a major change in public education that we're sort of in the middle of figuring out what is this going to look like, how many families are going to participate, what is going to be the financial impact, what does it look like if you still have a very robust public education infrastructure, or are you going to end up with a situation where the highest need students remain in public education and a lot of other families have departed to private education? A lot of that's playing out at the state level. It started to develop under the Biden administration, so it wouldn't necessarily have been stopped if Kamala Harris had been elected. But I think we will see more support for school choice at the federal level under a Trump administration.
Just a moment left, Erica. Trump's pledge of mass deportations, what impact might that have on schools?
So it's been really unclear sort of how much he can actually carry out this pledge and to what extent it will affect sort of regular working people versus people who are maybe already in the criminal justice system in some regard. But we have seen in the past when immigration enforcement has carried out these large-scale workplace raids in communities, thousands of children can see their parents detained overnight, and it has huge ripple effects on public education.
We covered a lot of ground there, didn't we? Erica Meltzer, I appreciate you making time for us on a holiday week. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Well, tomorrow is Thanksgiving, so will the political knives be out? We have new polling on whether people plan on bringing up politics during Thanksgiving dinner. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. After any presidential election, politics is poised to be an unwelcome course at Thanksgiving dinner tables across the country. Our chief pollster, Anthony Salvanto, took a look at whether Americans are in the mood for that kind of talk tomorrow.
It is Thanksgiving, and Americans are thinking, you're going to have to talk politics at the Thanksgiving dinner table. So we asked, and big majorities say they're going to try to avoid that. 7 in 10 say they're going to try to avoid it. Just under a third say they will try to talk politics. Now, if you look at this, the majority of folks, whether they voted for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump this year, do say they want to avoid it. Little more willingness to talk about it among Donald Trump voters. Maybe they feel like they have more good news or more to celebrate there. But take a look at what happens when you compare what people think the other folks at dinner voted for. You see that folks who think that they are going to be gathering with people who voted the same as them are a little more willing to talk politics. But if they think that they're going to be with a mix of different voters in there, they're a little less willing to talk politics. Maybe they don't want to get in those arguments. Maybe they're exhausted by it after a long election year. And I will show you that we do find a lot of folks are going to be in with a lot of different people. About 4 in 10 Harris voters are going to be gathering with folks they believe voted for Harris. About 4 in 10 Trump voters say they're going to be gathering with people who voted mostly for Donald Trump, but a lot of folks aren't sure or in a mix of both. But bigger picture, we asked people, what are you thankful for this year? And the answers, number one, far and away, is family and friends. That is followed closely by your health, freedom, faith, and oh, by the way, all of that really eclipses anything in politics, which I put here just for comparison. And on one note, to show what a lot of voters have in common after a very contested and some might say divisive election year, whether you voted for Kamala Harris or for Donald Trump, we find big numbers and even numbers who each say that they are especially grateful for family and friends. Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Anthony Salvanto, thank you very much. Same to you. There's only one way to end a politics show on Thanksgiving Eve, by looking back at Thanksgivings at the White House in previous years. And you can't forget the turkey pardon, but there is a major debate as to who was the first president to start the turkey pardon tradition. Some claim it was Abraham Lincoln, but most believe it's between Presidents Harry Truman and President John F. Kennedy. While Truman was first to receive a turkey as a gift, his presidential library argues he actually ate the turkeys. In 1963, when presented with the bird, Kennedy said, quote, "Let's keep him going." Nevertheless, the tradition has certainly stuck and has become a beloved event at the White House. So here are some of those highlights.
You are hereby pardoned. You will live in Disneyland. Now, Tater is here in a backup role just in case Tot can't fulfill his duties. So he's sort of like the vice turkey. We're working on getting him a pair of aviator glasses.
Upon being pardoned, Drumstick and his friend Wishbone will live out their days at Gobbler's Rest. Beautiful place. It's custom built.
Based on your temperament and commitment to being productive members of society, I hereby pardon Peach and Blossom.
Tater and Tot, still the best names. That does it for today. We're back with another edition of America Decides next Monday after the holiday. The Daily Report starts right now. Have a great Thanksgiving.